Ian,
Yes.
we had a pretty big study happen.
Big. That's twice. This episode.
news.
Really bringing the big. That's it. That's it.
You have too much energy for being multi-layered, and I can feel the heat emanating.
I know. That's what you've said that to me before. Everyone says it. I'm a little fucking heater.
So
Cold, gather around.
So the Video Game History Foundation.
Yeah, I thought I was starting this one.
I will lead you into it. They came out with a landmark study that made big waves on the internet and with social media and every gaming website. I saw a report on it one way or another, and I'll get to that in a second, called 87% Missing the Disappearance of Classic Video Games. New study reveals most classic video games are completely unavailable, by our pal Kelsey Lewin.
So Kelsey is the one who wrote this part. I'm sure, and I believe
She wrote the article. She didn't do all of the
I believe
research.
Phil Salvador did most of the research. His name is on that paper. Well, no, lots of people did research. Lots of volunteers. Everyone was in on it, but I believe Phil Salvador was the one who wrote the actual
study.
So Kelsey writes this. Now, first thing I want to say real quick is it's a big study. It's 47 pages. If you read the actual one, there are multiple layers to this. If you want information, gamehistory.org has an overview. Then there's an explanation article that will help you go through it. And then there's the actual study. So you can kind of decide how deep you want to get into this.
Sure.
So what this study aimed to do, the study had one specific goal. And the goal was to basically have something, as far as I can tell, basically have something that anyone can point to the next time this gets in front of Congress or something like that.
Copyright Office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the video game industry has said endlessly, over and over, that they are doing enough to protect their history and they don't need a library or anything like that because they are concerned about...
They don't want copyright exceptions in place.
They are concerned about it affecting bottom line. And their main excuse, which has been bought by Congress, is that they're doing enough for it. And Congress goes, oh, okay, and writes it off. So this study is, it was designed to directly show the next time that comes up that there is clear evidence that the video game industry is not doing nearly anything in terms of, backing up historical games and preserving them. The study does not purport to have a solution. They want that to be discussed further. Their main goal is to simply be able to go, no, you're wrong. And this is how wrong you are.
The scope of this study was to show commercial availability of past games.
Yes.
Before 2010, I believe.
It's before 2010. They want to. So basically, the goal was it has to be available, and it could be physical. Physical. It doesn't have to be digital, but it has to be available to purchase from the rights holder
now.
Sure.
As of like April. So when the study was written up. Sure.
And they mentioned that many times.
Sure.
So
could be a digital re-release. It could be like Antstream Arcade, which we'll talk about that in a bit. It could be any way it's legally available to play. So
the top layer here is is the basic information that I think most people are going to want to see, the most eye-grabbing information. And here are some of the things that the study pointed out. 13% of video games are currently being represented in the marketplace. No period in any time of game history defined in the study even cracked 20% representation. Now, I want to point out real quick that the highest, because I think this might come up later when I discuss things, or you and I discuss things, is 1990 to 1994. That is the highest level of representation, but it's still under 20%. What's interesting to me is you look at stuff like 95 to 99 and it's lower than that earlier period, but this makes sense because the 90 to 94 period is where a lot of nostalgia lies. It's where a lot of the Nintendo system nostalgia lies. It's a lot of the re-releases on Nintendo platforms, 16-bit games constantly getting remade. It makes sense to me that this era is where it's most represented.
If you include the mini consoles,
yes. Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, there's no shortage of that
the
stuff.
The 8 and early 16-bit era.
Yeah, at least for the titles that are well-known marquee titles, there's a pretty good representation.
Switch Online, you know, you have all the re-release packages, like you're saying. Yes.
So they say availability is low across every platform. Libraries and archives can digitally preserve but not digitally share video games right now. And that's an issue. And they bring up great points on that later. Like if you need to research a game that is hard to find and that game takes you 20 hours, that includes air travel, that includes lodging, people taking care of kids. It's just not a real solution. It's not feasible.
Yes, if you don't want to go, you know, if you want to do the piracy route or buy it yourself.
Well, and that's what we're talking about.
Yes.
I mean, specifically, we're talking about this in the most legal research-oriented way, because they even say, as a last resort, they resort to ROMs, but no one really wants to do that. They would rather have this, you know, centralized within a system.
Sure. Let me just give a quick caveat on what the study actually.
I was about to go into that. Yeah. So the study is a random sample of 1,500 games across history. That's one aspect.
27,627. This is console only.
This is 1,500 games. Pre-2010. That's 1,000. So that is the attempt to take care of a broader picture. They pick three different. They created three different ecosystems. There is
sub ecosystem.
Yes, there is an abandoned ecosystem, and for that they chose the Commodore 64. For the neglected ecosystem, they chose the Game Boy, and I think that's perfect. And then for the active ecosystem, PS2. I think that's also a great system to focus on, because that is kind of where the PlayStation 2 era or system is where. That's where Nintendo and Super Nintendo enthusiasm was really at 5-6 years ago, when everything was getting re-released. Now we're getting all the Grand Theft Auto games. We're getting all these games that are coming out. So it makes sense. It's a more modern choice, I think.
Sure.
The Game Boy segment used the entire Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance library. Every single game they studied for that one.
So they picked Game Boy, says, which includes Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance.
Yep.
They said in quotes, neglected ecosystem with demonstrable commercial interest but declining availability. You read this? Did they explain what their criteria was for the commercial interest level? Was that explained explicitly?
It is explained explicitly in the 47. Let me see if I can pull that up.
I'll do it while you talk. I'll control Epic. Because I missed when I was skimming it.
So they definitely talked about what I don't exactly recall the PlayStation 2. I think it's because it's frankly that's just obvious. I'm sure they probably discussed it. C64 they discussed. They went out of their way, I feel like, to discuss Game Boy, and they did that because Game Boy is a great choice, but I don't know that everyone's going to see it right away. And Game Boy is an amazing choice for it because it shows how even modern preservation attempts left to video game companies falls short because nothing is permanent. The Game Boy, I think just for amusement's sake, the TurboGrafx 16 would be another one to look at. The Game Boy is interesting to look at because on the Wii U, or on the Wii U and the 3DS, the eShop, there were multiple games that were available.
Okay.
And when the eShop shut down, they lost over half of the available Game Boy titles.
I think that's why they said. I think that's the reason why they picked it because they used to have a lot of Game Boy games on Virtual Console, on the Wii U. They're available 3DS, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these. So it's really great because you have the worldwide one to just kind of get like a base idea. C64 is truly like an abandoned ecosystem, and that's another one that shows where things like Antstream Arcade. So whereas Game Boy is impressive because it shows what happens when something leaves, C64 is interesting because there is a presence, but it's all in like one or two areas. It's in Antstream and like the C64 Mini.
That's what I was trying to get at. I wanted to say how they defined high interest because it's not defined explicitly. And I think that's what they're saying. Well, we can show there was interest because 15 years ago they were on these ecosystems. Obviously, Nintendo was making money on the Virtual Console, on the 3DS, selling them, and now they're not. which I'd have to get into the nuts and bolts of, but that's at least, I guess, the mindset of why that's a high interest system. That's all.
The nuts and bolts made my mind buzz. I really loved reading like some of that nitty gritty shit, but I think that's partially because of my current job.
I'm interested to know, just from obviously you have a limited man hours and power to, because they literally are checking Moby Games. They got this is how they did this. They got a completely random sample of games based upon these criteria from Moby Games themselves. Said, here's a list of the games.
Yep.
Now you have to manually check if these are commercially available now. So this means you literally have to check each game to say, okay, you gave me a list of 200 games. Maybe I'm assigning 200 games on the team. You have to check to see if they're available. That's how they did this. I'd be interested to ask why, or know why, looking at this, why they decided it was necessary to do every single Game Boy game. Right? They did 100% of the population for that.
Because you can make it extremely accurate. I think the reason is because it makes that segment extremely accurate. And
absolutely. Yes.
And they wanted that segment, I think, and I haven't talked to them about this, but I think they wanted that segment extremely accurate because they can get a very precise number of how these things fall apart.
Sure.
Because I think the number that's really important there is because they did do it prior to the closing of the eShops. They did a percentage availability if you include everything that was in the eShop, and it was like 16.7% or something representation. When the eShop closed down, they lost 6.7 or something, leaving only 5.6 remaining, and that's a number that I think really people need to see.
Sure, I'm just saying from looking at this overall, I would have loved to have seen. Obviously, there's man hours involved. More of the overall historical game sample size increase because it's only about 6%, 7% of the overall population. I would have loved to have seen that bumped up to at least 10%, just from my perspective, to be a little more accurate. That's all.
Well, so here's my thing with that. I get it. When I first saw it, I was like, I wish they had done 2,000, 2,500. Yeah. But you're always going to want more. And while it would have been more exhaustive, it wouldn't have proven the point any better.
Well, it could have, the way they break it down here, which I'll get into, because they also break it down by decades. And when you get to the 70s, the sample size for the 70s is extremely small.
Sure.
So it's unreliable, to talk about that.
Yes, but I guess my point is, like I said, it makes it more exhaustive and it makes it more interesting per decade, but it's not going to change the outcome of the study, and it's the outcome that matters the most.
Sure, but let me just talk about when they go over the results on page 27. This is where it stands out because they break these up into 5-year segments, like you pointed out before. So from 1970 to 74, there was only 17 games in that sample with 0 games. Like the odds of getting a game from the 70s and only 17 games to be re-released is so small. In the late 70s, 112. 75 to 79, only 1. So what I'm saying is, I would like to see those numbers maybe bolstered more, be a little more accurate. Because it's literally not less than 1% or 0%. It's like, I'm sure you can find them somewhere re-released. It's just we have to expand it a little more.
I understand.
For example, we know Pong's been re-released recently on Atari 50. It's not 0% any game from 74. That's all I'm saying.
It's not, but the goal was not to do it entirely. It was to make the point. I guess the only thing when I saw it and I was looking at it, and obviously it probably changes some stuff, I was like, and I did not do this work, but so hats off to them. I would have looked at something like that. The only thing I noticed is I looked at something and I would have been like, Moby Games, give me a random 10. Give me another 10. Fill this segment out. Just give me 20.
I would have done a sub-study and just bolstered up these smaller. That's what I would have been. Because, for example, Atari 50 has literally a couple of dozen of games released on that fitting in some of these categories that...
but
you know what I mean? That's all.
But when you look at that, a lot of them aren't going to be available. Some are going to be available.
They are available, though. That's what I mean, though.
A lot of them aren't. Some will be.
The point is, it's above 0%. That's all I'm saying.
But it would still be in the lowest.
It could be 1%.
Still be in the lowest percentile.
It could be 2. It could be 3. It could be 4.
And that 1 or 2 or 3 does not affect the outcome of the study. For interest reasons, I would like to know it, but that was not the point of the study.
It's in the results, though. That's what I'm saying. It's in the results. They broke it out over 5-year periods. That's all.
Sure. Okay.
I'm just saying. I love to see that. I love to see them go down because there's not a huge amount of games that existed in 65 to 69, 70 to 74. You could have done more than 17 for that period. You could have done more. That's all I'm saying. Because even though it's randomized, when you look at the time periods, like 269 games between 994, 225 between 95 and 99.
No, there's bigger representation.
I would have loved to see for some of these groups to be a little bit, you know what I mean? Like 89 to 80. For some reason, there's 219 80 to 84 versus only 169 and 85 to 89.
Well, random is random.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Like I want to see them fudge it a little more with some of these populations, just to so when I see that it looks more dramatic than what it is. That's all.
Sure.
You want to talk about Commodore 64? That's your.
I trust the data people they got, but yes, I understand. Do I want to talk about Commodore 64? No, not really. I don't think I need to go into that specifically, other than to say,
No.
I love the Commodore 64 Game Boy. Those I love those in there because, like I said, Commodore 64 right now has very little representation, but the representation it does have is because of streaming and micro consoles. Mm-hmm. Game Boy had a larger representation, but the reason it has that representation, the representation it does now, is because it lost various streaming and digital distribution methods. The Commodore, that's in the Commodore 64. You could extrapolate that to just about any other system in that era, or a lot of them, I would say.
Oh, sure. You're not going to find a lot of re-releases officially of ZX Spectrum games,
right?
Stuff like that, like the things that weren't like they didn't have like a legacy outside of a certain little time period. Like why would you still think about those 25 years later when there's no other products? You know what I mean? To continue the legacy.
But Game Boy proved a point within a point. So I think that one was perfect. And then PlayStation 2 just makes sense to me following games. I mean, you see that stuff getting released everywhere. And the other reason, that was the thing. You were looking at it. That was the reason. The reason they considered Sony also high activity or high what's the word I'm looking for? It was neglected. High interest is because Sony, since PS3 had backwards compatibility.
Sure.
Then there was digital PS2 games. PS4 had all of that. Now everything's on streaming. So not only are there remakes of games, but there are easy ways to play a lot of that right now.
Sure. Okay. So obviously, if this comes up to like you said, Congress again, Copyright Office, is going to be the ESA versus the interest of libraries that want some form of digital preservation available for this.
But there's and now the data is there
ammo.
to counteract the smooth talking.
Sure. So that brings that hopefully gets you to a point where, okay, in a legal sense, I can go and download. Say I'm doing a study. And obviously the ESA is afraid that it would just be like archive.org where you just want to download stuff to play.
All you got they say that, but I think it's also greed because all you have to do is look at modern libraries. You can go and rent video games at a modern library. You can't stream them. You can rent digital movies. You can rent you can rent digital books. You can rent all of this stuff that someone out there could still be making money on. Sure. So I don't really see any difference.
Well, with the digital stuff, from what I saw,
they limit it.
Yeah, it's like whatever, 5 a month. You can get 5 movies a month because it's like
and there are certain amount with like ebooks, they can only check out certain numbers at a time.
Sure.
So this seems like the way to go.
The argument, playing the devil's advocate, this is what the ESA would say, and it's somewhat reality. The books and movies are a linear experience in terms of like you watch them.
I knew this was going to come. I know, but
this is the argument.
Ridiculous.
It's not. Well, it's the form though, the medium. You read a book once, you're not going to read that book every single day. Like you're done with it for the most part. Yeah, I'll read it like once a year. I'll read Great Expectations, but Great Expectations to me is Great Expectations to you in terms of the words on the page. A video game is an interactive medium, so it's more infinitely experienceable.
But why does that matter if you're renting a game from a library for a set period of time digitally? It doesn't.
I'm just saying that's what they're going to say.
Sure, but it's bullshit because the library experience does not affect that at all. It's still renting something to, and the thing is, we're already getting into areas where we're talking about people who just want to play games. The study specifically states in many points that they are doing this from the vantage point of research and history. They are not that. I mean, I think they purposely avoided talking about libraries and the greater consumer availability of games for that reason.
So this gets to a higher point about when we talk about, I guess, looking at history. What are you actually doing? Because this honestly just came up recently, what I was involved with, in a little bit of a way. Our pal Norm, gaming historian, just did an excellent retrospective on the Fairchild Channel F. Right. Mm-hmm. To do that video and to do all his videos properly, he buys the real hardware. You know, he experiences them on the actual hardware to play it. I actually shipped him my Fairchild Channel Fs. I shipped him my Model 1 and Model 2. I'm not saying he played them on all, but at least he wanted to photograph them and have them there and the cards properly. So you will always, in terms of education, in terms of like real experience, that you're going to need to have some access to real hardware somewhere.
For some of it, yes, but there are plenty of research applications where you don't.
No, yes. But in terms of, this is my next point, but in terms of passing on the true experience of playing the games the way they were, and obviously when they were created, something close to the real hardware is needed, with the actual, something close to resembling the real controllers. If you have a CRT, great, or something that could resemble it. That's the experience that we're looking to pass on. And this is what?
I mean, I get it, but I don't think many applications of why people would need this would absolutely require that experience. There are things that I think would require that experience, but I don't think everything does.
What I'm saying is having digital repositories that are legal to access this, that gets you researchers. Great. I can get all this stuff without going online and paying lots of money, or I can say they have qualms about downloading them illegally. I'm sure some people do. I don't know. Yes, that's great. But you still have a long-term, and I talked about this with Kelsey. I talked to her about this. I was trying to get her to sign off on this, co-sign this, about this solves one problem, research, right? And that's great. The next wave would be, okay, long term, how do we get to a point where we have a fundamental way to pass on the knowledge and experience of these past consoles and games to the next generations, right? Because that's what we're really talking about. That's really the end game.
I honestly don't think it's going to matter that much. I understand. I personally, there's a reason why I have thousands of dollars of PC Engine games in an original system.
You're cutting up before my point. So
I just don't think it's right. I don't think for most people that's going to matter.
In terms of what? In terms of like
having the original controller and the original hardware.
I'm not saying everyone has to own that. That's what I'm saying. You're literally cutting off before I'm getting to my point. So this is what I would like to see in terms of like long term. This is and this is not something for just the Video Game History Foundation to try to address. This is something larger to happen, because the fundamental issue is this: how do we not force people to care? How do we educate and integrate these past video game experiences to the following generations? So 100 years from now, can a child that's 6 years old wearing his, silver futuristic Twilight Zone jumpsuit, how do we make them care to know about the existence of something like the Fairchild Channel F? Like, will that even matter at that point? So the only thing you can do is hope that educationally, and in terms of we have a structured way, and it has to be structured or it will be lost, a structured way of handing down this knowledge to next generations.
Well, sure. We got to get here.
And this is what I discussed, and this is what I think should be the game plan going forward. But this is going to be a lot of not just willpower. It's going to take a lot of work and organization to do it. And I'm not sure off the top of my head how to do it. I just know this is sort of the foundation I would lay. You have to get at the academic side. You have to look at accreditation programs for library science programs and information science. You have to let them know that that video game history has to be included in your curriculum. You have to have like, hey, you want to graduate with a library science degree? you have to have a course about video game history included. And these are the benefits why. These are what your patrons at your future libraries and universities, these are the things they want to learn about. They're going to want to learn about the Atari 2600. They're going to learn about the Fairchild Channel F. They're going to want to learn about the NES, because eventually the NES is going to be non-existent in people's eyes. It's going to be 100 years from now, look at this stupid thing that's here.
I feel like we're closer to it than further.
You see my point, though?
Yeah.
So the point is, you have to lay the foundation now for these people that are coming up now and getting these jobs and running all your local libraries, running your university research centers. This has to be like a web that develops now, so that 20 years from now, 10 years from now, you start to see the fruits of the labor, where you have workshops, you have things at every local library where it's set up for that, so that 20 years from now, the way we go to every library now and we see renting movies, renting music, that's how it should be for video games, where it exists in a space there. And these physical buildings, there are tens of thousands of them. We have to get into there. That's the way I see it. Because then we have a 6-year-old 20 years from now, there's at least a chance that they can be exposed to all this old shit that we grew up with. That's what libraries are for.
Yes.
That's to me is the end game that I think we can eventually get to in a perfect world. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's model trains, whether it's old toys, it'll all be lost eventually, unless there's a concerted effort to expose people to it and make it fun. Because
I mean, but we're getting there. We've got the Strong Museum of Play. I mean, Video Game History Foundation exists to push that information out there.
I'm just telling you the method.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's fairly obvious. It's you got to make sure that there are academic programs, just like there are for literature and movies, to cover games. I don't think that's anything anyone disagree with. That's way outside the scope of the study.
Yes, but the scope of the study is to, if you're trying to eventually get to the point where people have access to this stuff that they can look at and play. What I'm talking about is, well, that's great, but if people aren't interested enough to do it, it's going to be sort of like not a fool's errand, but we need the people 25 years from now to want to be able to want to use those resources that will be available.
We can't get to that point without this happening first. That's what I'm saying. To make people care about video games and still have them be impossible to access doesn't serve anything. When we get to you get to this point, you get to the point where someone where you get a digital library, it's much easier to get people to care if they can pick it up. It would be impossible to make people to care about literature if they couldn't pick up a book and read it.
Sure, but
you have to have.
But they still have to know about those games and what they are and what they do. That's my point.
Yes, but that's that's for other people and other places.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like that's the end game.
Sure,
that's the end game.
Oh yeah, I think that's what everyone would want.
So something like Norm doing a Fairchild Channel F video, which that will get the word out to, that will get the word out to so many more people that ever played the Fairchild Channel F will hopefully eventually see Norm's video about it and learn more about it. What I'm saying is, imagine that being built into all the curriculums for the people coming up that'll be managing libraries, where it's like that's going to be, if that's required, then the impetus then will be like, well, I have to have this available. I have to make this part of this experience, because again, it should be alongside movies.
I see what you're saying, but I feel like we're on different sides of a chicken or an egg argument, and that's all.
Oh, I don't see it as chicken or egg. I see it as a chicken and a rooster. Yeah, I see it as they have to be side by side.
Okay, I think this was a good segment we did. Let's cut it off now before we start.
Talking about omelets,
divulging into all sorts of other places. I do kind of want an omelet.